What's up, everybody, and welcome to uh, Why Am I Like This in the year of our Lord 2024, the month of May. On the 3rd day of May, according to the time zone I am in, which is in Perth, Australia, or I think I'll call it Borroloo, which is like the indigenous name for this land. And I'm aware that it's still the 2nd of May in the Americas as I'm speaking, but it is the 3rd of May according to UTC or GMT. Although I don't believe it's daytime there yet, so according to like the lore of the Walkers of Blue Stone, it's still a moon night of Jupiter Day there. And I like to do these sessions on Fridays or Venus days. But I'll also say that according to my time zone, it's the 3rd day of the 5th month of the year, which is a special number for me because 3 is a Mercury number and 5 is a Venus number, according again to the Walkers of Blue Stone. And Venus Day is my born day, and the hour I was born in was a Mercury hour. So the numbers are very special for me. And I would say like the topic that I felt called to bring into this container is very special to me as well. But before I talk about the topic, I'll just like introduce the container again for people who might be listening for the first time. And I'll say, why am I like this is a container. In this context, I'll describe it as a container which I hold for discussions related to offerings of topics or questions which I receive inside the spiritual community that we call the broom and outside the broom. And my intention has always been for this container to be one where people can talk about the topic from their personal experience. And I include in personal experience our experience of the experiences of others, right? So if people tell us things, that becomes part of our personal experience. And I would say that when we learn about reality through, I'll say, like vaster life forms, sometimes known as gods or deities, or the mystery or the one, then that also becomes part of our personal experience. And I would say, like in this container, my personal experience is that I'm channeling a vaster life form that I know as Red Star Green Cloud, or Nobu the Elder, or Levantara, or the soul complex of the heart of Sekhmet, or Sirius C. And y'all are welcome to articulate your personal experience of anything in this container too. And if you'd like to join us live so you can share your truth in this container, then you can find the link to join the Discord server where these containers are held every Venus day at I'll say 3 p.m. Perth Borroloo time. No, it's 10 a.m. Perth Borroloo time, or moon nights of Jupiter days, aka Thursdays, at 10 p.m. New York time, or I think it's 2 p.m. UTC. No, yes, 2 p.m. UTC on Jupiter days or Thursdays. And yeah, I'd like to thank the people who are here live, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them as well. And before I talk about the topic, I'll say that in this container, my guarantee is that contexts will be disenmeshed, aka karma will be released, and no contexts will be enmeshed, aka karma will not be accumulated due to this container or due to what is experienced of this container, whether you're listening in or contributing live, or if you're listening in or contributing outside of current space time, in the space and time in which you're listening to a recording. Does anybody want to unmute and say hi before I talk about the topic? I have to scroll to find the topic again.
Yes, I'll say hi.
Who are you?
Wow, it's funny you asked that. Well, I'm Intrepid Bodies, a
Who
tender and a
goes there?
gardener. Park. Oh, reveal yourself. But yes, I'm a tender and gardener in the broom. Also a member of, gosh, like all the lineage spaces in here. Just happy to be here live. And yeah, there's a lot coming up for me regarding this question. A lot of it is not legible right now. So I am, looking forward to how things unfold. And thank you for having me, Nova.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'll also say that the last time that I transmitted on this topic, I was in Sofia in Bulgaria, and I chose to bring this topic into the container as well as I would say, like, I chose to bring in a topic which I don't think was posed as a question, but I was talking about the karma of Pleiadian blue avians relating to the introduction of writing systems. And I would say, like, the consequences of introducing writing systems to humans via, I would say, like, probably a few different prophets, but the one I think is most known for, I'd say, like, successfully introducing writing systems was a being known as Tahuti, or Top. And I felt like the transmission was pretty cool, but I became aware afterwards that my internet connection was bouncing, and so the recording was basically unsalvageable. And since then, I've gone on to talk about the karma of the Pleiadian blue avians separately. And if you look in the archive of the Broom Radio podcast, you might see an episode called Why Am I Like This? Red, Blue, and Green Avians. And if you want to check that out, you can hit play on that recording. And if you have any thoughts on what I shared there, if you feel like I violated the guarantee of that container, then I'd love to hear about it. But given that there was so much of what I'll call like interference in that container, and I was also talking about this topic, I'm very curious to see what comes up in this container. So I feel like I've been like delaying gratification on the issue of the topic for long enough. So I'll say that the topic that I feel called to bring into this container was introduced by a member of the broom and the tender of the broom named Adam Archetype, whose birthday is today, yesterday. It's his solar return. And the question, is it a question? Well, it's more of a statement. Adam Archetype said last year in December, in addition to those named above, I couldn't help be drawn to read the mythology of Andromeda, and it made me wonder, anyone have any gnosis on the way names are, quote, given, unquote, open parenthesis, heard, close parenthesis, for celestial bodies by astronomers? It feels like an interesting space to meditate on regarding the blending of projections from one's field, open parenthesis, i.e., the astronomer, close parenthesis, and communication with spirit. So I'm just gonna restate this, denuded of the context it came from, so it's a bit more clear. But I'll restate the question is, how do celestial bodies, aka galaxies, stars, asteroids, meteors, planets, moons, how do they receive names? And I'll also focus the response to this question on Andromeda. And of course, I'm really curious to hear what y'all already have to offer. Happy Born Day, says Hoda. Thank you. I feel like earlier Hoda had said, I'm getting a question on cosmic differentiation and how celestial bodies play a role in that process. And I'm kind of curious if you want to say more about that and how it relates to the topic of how celestial bodies receive names, and I guess myths, because I would say that the names are often portals to myth.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually that's sort of you kind of previewed it a bit with what you just said. And I guess, yeah, the question that was coming up for me around cosmic differentiation, I think kind of relates to how sometimes I'll see the cosmos, or my relationship to the cosmos is one that was discovered through my interaction with different myths, different cosmologies and stories. And so, and I feel like at some point in that reading and digesting and studying, I became really fascinated with the etymology of particular star systems and constellations, and beyond the etymology also how the naming came to be. So looking up what the ritual was kind of in relation to Adam's question regarding how do the astrologers or astronomers fit into the naming process, and I would even say the deification process of different planetary bodies, and then also cosmic different cosmic and celestial bodies as well. So I feel like I said a couple of different things. And yeah, the question still feels ripe. So I'm curious, yeah, what comes up for y'all?
Whew. Well, I'm looking up the etymology of Andromeda because you mentioned etymology. And I'll also say that I just received a notification from a Twitter account called Space Weather Live that there is a strong R3 radio blackout in progress right now. And it's more or less centered over, I'll say I think it's called the China Sea, but it's affecting the region I'm in right now. Y'all can still hear me pretty well, right? Yes, good. So the etymology of Andromeda comes from ancient Greek and Andromeda, and if you kind of drill down a little bit into that, you get Anna means man, and Medo means rule over. So Andromeda basically means the ruler of men, which I feel like is pretty interesting because when you look at the myth of Andromeda, I'm just going to look at Wikipedia, which, a lot of people say that Wikipedia is problematic. And I do believe it can be inaccurate in some contexts, but I don't believe it's inaccurate in this context, particularly as the myth comes from a very long time ago. And since Wikipedia is, in some ways, could be said to be like democratically, I'll say like dictated, which sounds like an oxymoron. And it's like a very old myth. I would say like there's very little like froth around this myth, so like not too much contention in current time. So I would say like Wikipedia's account of this myth is probably fairly stable. And I'm going to read. It says, in Greek mythology, Andromeda is the daughter of Cepheus, the king of Ethiopia, and his wife Cassiopeia. When Cassiopeia boasts that she, or Andromeda, is more beautiful than the Nereids, Poseidon sends the sea monster Cetus to ravage the coast of Ethiopia as divine punishment. Queen Cassiopeia understands that chaining Andromeda to a rock as a human sacrifice is what will appease Poseidon. Perseus finds her as he is coming back from his quest to decapitate Medusa and brings her back to Greece to marry her and let her reign as his queen. With the head of Medusa, Perseus petrifies Cetus to stop it from terrorizing the coast any longer. So I'll say like something that comes through when I'm like reading the summary of this myth is that like Andromeda is sort of like I'd say like she's, by virtue of being the daughter of Cepheus and Cassiopeia, and then also needing to be rescued by Perseus, and even being offered as a sacrifice. It's very hard for me to reconcile that with the etymology of the ruler of men, because I would say that like in all of those interactions, she's sort of like in a position of being helpless. Whereas, like, when I read The Ruler of Men, what I kind of get on that is that she's like more powerful. But I guess like what's coming through for me right now is like in that myth, we're not necessarily talking about what we might call men, because many of these figures are considered to be gods. I'm kind of curious if anything else comes up right now. I'm looking at the Wikipedia, and there's some controversy about her portrayal as a light-skinned woman, whereas we've sort of known the people of Ethiopia to have darker skin. And I guess like maybe more pertinently, what's coming up for me is that myth is sort of like a way for people to characterize energies in many contexts, and not necessarily meant to be taken as like a literal story about what's happening to these celestial bodies. Because I think it's pretty hard for anyone to look at a galaxy, or, well, let me first say that like it's pretty hard for people to look at a galaxy and then see a princess, whether that princess has like light skin or dark skin or like medium lightness or darkness skin. But then I'll also say that this mythology probably, or this myth, I should say, was probably created before the constellation was spotted. And then I'll say that my understanding is the galaxy, which is now called Andromeda, was given the name Andromeda because it's in the same part of the sky as a constellation called Andromeda. And I would say that the constellation was likely assigned to the myth because the character in the myth had some of the qualities that were related to the person who was tasked with naming the celestial body. So I guess like right there we have like a delineation of one of the mechanisms by which a celestial body might receive a name and therefore be associated with a myth, which I would say has nothing to do with the celestial body itself or the energy that comes from it, right? So to make that really clear, I'll say that the galaxy that we call Andromeda received a name which was given to a constellation which occupies the same part of the sky, which is to say that, like, I don't think that the person who called the galaxy Andromeda was necessarily feeling into the energies, let's say, or communing with the galaxy of Andromeda when that person, most likely a man, or it could have been multiple people who agreed that this name was appropriate, they weren't necessarily communing with that galaxy when they gave it the name Andromeda. They were sort of conveniently calling it Andromeda because the constellation of Andromeda was in the same part of the sky. So I'd say, like, for me, that's one way in which the myth of Andromeda departs from the consciousness of the celestial body or galaxy that I call Ma'at. And then I would say that I would not call constellations celestial bodies. And I've talked about this before, and I feel like I'm a little bit of a gadfly on this matter, but many of the stars which make up constellations are actually further apart from one another in our conception of space than they are far away from Earth, if that makes sense. And I'll say that, like, because we're looking at them from the perspective of Earth, within the space-time of Earth, within, like, I'll say, like, our astral realm, which is like a realm of perception that's just shaped by the karma that informed the way our bodies are made and the way that they perceive reality. We see them as being close to each other by angle, whereas, like, longitudinally, they're often very, very far apart. So, like, you could say, like, one star in Andromeda is further away, it's closer to Earth than it is to another star in Andromeda, longitudinally. But then, like, from an angular perspective, they look like they're close to one another only from the perspective of Earth, only within our perception making organs within our bodies. So for me, it's difficult to say that the constellation of Andromeda is a body versus, like, separate bodies, which are, I would say, like, somewhat arbitrarily grouped together by, I'll call it astronomers for now. It's really funny, but there's a GIF in here where I think someone's drinking something out of a little cup, and it's the same color as what I'm drinking out of my cup, which is very similar in the sense that it's like has very similar proportions. I'm drinking a mixture of matcha, turmeric, cinnamon, nutmeg, full cream, and coffee. So I guess, like, Does it make sense what I'm saying to y'all about like constellations not being celestial bodies? Mm, like I would say an individual star is a celestial body. And of course, like star systems which contain multiple stars and likely planets and likely moons are also celestial bodies. But I wouldn't say that most constellations are celestial bodies because they contain separate bodies. Like it's like imagine if you're just looking at if you have like a scene, I'm gonna like make a container, but you can imagine like you're in the center of a container, and then somebody, let's say like you're in Borlu, where I am, and then you're looking at somebody who's in Adelaide, which is like 2 hours east of Borlu or Perth, and then you're looking at somebody who's in, I'll say like Auckland, or even if you go like further and your line of sight includes somebody from, I'm just gonna like go further east of New Zealand, and you get to Argentina, right? So if you're looking at somebody in Adelaide, which is 2 hours east by plane from Perth, and then you're looking at somebody in Argentina, which is probably like 18 hours east of Perth, then they look like they're close to one another because they're in the same line of sight. But you wouldn't say that those two people are one celestial body or one body, right? Like I think it's pretty clear that they're separate bodies. Um, Whereas if you were looking at two people in Adelaide, they'd be at the same longitudinal distance, but they also wouldn't necessarily be two bodies. But maybe if those two people were like dancing with one another or like hugging or copulating or making a baby, I think like there's like a stronger case to say that they're one body which is producing another body if they have a baby, right? Like in that moment of being together, they are like one body which is creating another body. But hopefully that illustrates what I'm saying about constellations not being celestial bodies. And I'd say that like I think to get to the crux of Adam's question, that an astronomer or just like a layperson could look at those two stars and they could commune with those two stars. And from their perspective, it'd be very easy, given how much our perception is dominated by sight, it would be quite easy to conflate the two energies of those stars with one another and then come up with some kind of like compound energy. And then be like, okay, like this energy feels like so funny. Somebody in the house I'm in right now is playing the piano, and I'll say it's making it a little more difficult to hold the container, so I'm just going to ground my field. Can y'all hear the piano? It's faint. So now it's stopped. I didn't say anything, but it stopped. It's pretty wild to me how like interference comes up in our matrix of reality. I think a lot of people be like, oh, like they're just drawing coincidences, but this is the second time I've talked about this, and I'd say like the times I've talked about this about 6 months apart, I want to say. Maybe slightly less than 6 months apart, and weird interferences come up each time. Like I've recorded many live sessions on the Brim Radio, and there've been no issues with my connection. And I'll say like hardly anybody ever plays the piano in this house, but the timing of this coming up is very interesting. Anyway, so what I was saying is that somebody could look at two stars which are close to one another, and because our realm of perception is dominated by sight, they might conflate the energies of those two celestial bodies and sort of conclude that they feel like one energy, and then be like, okay, like that energy feels like, well, what's around me, right? What's around me that other people are also aware of, so I can communicate what I'm feeling about this constellation, let's say, to other people. And I would say, like, the myth of Andromeda is something which is like fairly well established, right? Like everything I think I was saying about the stability of that myth in Wikipedia probably applied fairly well to the time when the constellation of Andromeda was named. Does that make sense? So I kind of liken it to just being like a regular person meditating. And I feel like most of y'all who are listening to this are probably like, I'll say like fairly sensitive, or probably have had a number of experiences which I would call like direct experiences of the divine. And you probably find it yourself in the position sometimes. I would say like probably most of y'all who are listening probably have many experiences of the divine which feel direct, which feel like wordless, right? Like maybe you get images, maybe some of you get words. I would say like the first set of people would be experiencing the divine clairvoyantly. The second set of people might be experiencing the divine clairaudiently, or they might be doing some kind of like thought form shuffling, which we kind of talked a little bit about on the final episode of Roundup, which went out on the podcast yesterday, or today if you're in America. There's this process that Hoda and I were describing as like shuffling through thought forms or memories, which are a frequency match for the frequency of that direct experience. And then, once you find something which feels like a frequency match for that experience, then you might share it with another person if you felt called to share it with another person. And I would say that, like, whether it's through like intuitive frequency matching or through like, I would say like logical operating, the outcome of that process is to share a word or a concept or many words, or even like drawings or like music, which is going to communicate something to another human most of the time, such that they understand something about your direct experience of the divine via the portal of whatever is shared. And so I'm seeing here in Wikipedia that Andromeda is one of the 48 constellations listed by the 2nd century Greco-Roman astronomer Ptolemy. So, I think while Ptolemy was like naming or articulating the received names, or the agreed upon names of these 48 constellations, he was probably going through a similar process, which my sense is like was more logical and less intuitive. But, going through this process, he was probably looking for a name which would communicate to other people something about the nature of this constellation, which again is not a celestial body. And I'll also say that since he was publishing the names of 48 constellations, that there's probably some way in which like the names of each of those 48 constellations were chosen in order to, I'd say, like situate those constellations relative to one another, which I think is like another way in which like someone's direct gnosis of the energy of a celestial body can differ from um, the meaning that it ends up accumulating due to the name that it's given, because it's being defined relatively rather than absolutely. And then I'll say that often, like, the names of constellations which contain celestial bodies were based on the shapes of those constellations and their resemblance to different forms according to the people who named them. And this occurs like not only in like Greco-Roman astronomy, but also in the astronomy practices of many indigenous lineages, right? Where like they see shapes that constellations make, which take up a certain portion of the sky. And then they see those shapes and they're like, okay, that looks like a bear. I'm going to call this constellation the bear, or Ursa Minor. Or this looks like a cassowary, so I'm going to call this constellation whatever the indigenous name for a cassowary is. But again, like that form is informed by the perspective from Earth in our fabric of space according to our perception making organs. And it's not necessarily coming from, I would say, like a direct experience of the energies of those celestial bodies. And then I'll also say that often the stars which were being grouped together as constellations take up like equal portions of the sky because people were using the stars in order to navigate. And so, according to like how, let's say, like the sun and its position correlated to the position of these stars, because the sun moves like fairly, well, I'd say like the earth moves fairly slowly around the sun, and it can be mapped to weather, which is very important to ancient people. They were able to do something along the lines of like, okay, it feels like it's this time of the year, the sun is in this part of the sky, we know that at this time of the year, when we keep walking this way from wherever we are now, which is where we are because the weather in this place is very conducive to survival, then we will get to another place at this time of year. So I'm here at this time of year. If I follow this constellation, which is like, let's say like 2 constellations over from where the sun is or where the moon is, then after 2 days, I'll get to a place where the weather is also conducive to our survival and our thriving. Which is to say that when you're using the stars in order to like figure out where you are on Earth, then I would say like the demand of the meaning making process according to those stars is quite different than just like communing with those stars without necessarily having like your survival or your thriving predicated upon your understanding of the nature of the consciousness of those stars. So I think I more or less like talked about like 6 different ways in which like quote celestial bodies unquote might be given names which are not the same thing as just meditating in a serene state on the celestial body itself. And hopefully like this is sort of like answering I'll say answering the question that Adam asked, or I'd say like hopefully my offering is providing both the metaphysical and the physical artifacts that are required for the spiritual expansion and or refinement of y'all with regard to these star systems and other celestial bodies. And I guess like I'll talk a little bit about like what I receive about the galaxy named Andromeda, which I call my art, which I would say I've received in a position of privilege, right? Like, I'm not trying to figure out where I need to go so I have access to clean water, and that, there are animals that me and my fellow tribes people can hunt, or, you know, I'm not looking for like edible plants and berries and worms and mushrooms at a particular time of year. Um, I would say I do have material needs because I still have a human body in this matrix, but I would say that, like, overall, for most people in most parts of the world, it is easier for us to get our material needs met. And that's not to say that we don't go about getting our material needs met with some level of like grasping or anxiety. And I would say, like, most of that, in my opinion, is carried over from the trauma of our ancestors when it came to getting their material needs met. But I would say it's more possible for us to get our material needs met in a state of equanimity in more places for more people in most times than it ever has been before. And then if we're talking about so-called immaterial needs, although I think like emotions can be traced to like hormones, um, but when it comes to like, say, getting our emotional or our spiritual needs met, I would actually say that like in our time, it's probably more difficult for more people in more places and more times to feel like they have a sense of belonging, um, which I'll kind of use as an umbrella term that I hope covers like what I mean by emotional needs and spiritual needs. But I'll say that a lot of like my spiritual refinement process has been about being deprived of both material needs and emotional needs and spiritual needs. And I'll even say like having my perspective attacked, or I think like most people in Western countries now call this being gaslit, um, in order to show me, I'll say like arisings or textures of spirit that appeared in my awareness when I wasn't getting what I needed or when my perspective was being attacked, so that I could get to the root of the trauma in my own vessel, and I'd say like in my vessel due to the trauma experienced by my earth ancestors and my sky ancestors, so I could heal those wounds, so that I could experience a state of equanimity while I was communing with these stars and other things, right? Just like communing with reality, so that I could, I would say, like, see reality clearly. Um, does that make sense? Like, some people will say simply that you need to be pressed up against your karma. In my experience, like one of my teachers, or my former teachers, Kenneth Ovey, used to say, like, you need to be pressed up a bit to karma in order to get traction on it. That's kind of like a paraphrasing of how he would often talk about it to me and to other people that I shared containers with. Um, like, we need to experience the suffering that arises when we get our needs met or don't get them met, in order to, I would say, like, for me, discern the texture and the shape of them, so that those edifices can be dissolved, or so that karma can be released. So that I would say that like the awareness which is bound up in those, I would say, like, karmic forms, can be unbound and return to its place in the space and time of our metaphysical bodies. which I've talked about before and why am I like this, so I won't go into it too much again. But I would say that when that karma is bound in these, when that energy, or when the awareness of those moments of space-time are bound up in karmic forms, it shapes our perception, which means that we cannot necessarily see reality clearly, which means that we cannot necessarily discern the energy of celestial bodies clearly, which means that, yeah, we may end up missing individual celestial bodies and grouping them together as stars. You could say that like the need to use groups of stars, which take up roughly equal parts of the sky, is also a result of karma, right? Like, as all of our material circumstances are downstream of karma. I would say like the desperation with which we are like looking to find a solution to understand where we should go at this time of year, when the sun is in this part of the sky and the weather feels like this, is also downstream of karma, which I would say again is like formed and attaches to the trauma of not getting our needs met. You know, publishing a list of 48 constellations so that people recognize the work that you and the other people that you work with are doing may also be a behavior that arises from a karmic form that attaches to scarcity wounds, right? Like, I've been doing this work, I need to be recognized for this work, my work needs to be patronized. It's not going to be recognized if I just say that I was meditating on this celestial body and I received this name, which nobody has ever heard before. Instead, you're going to be like, well, I'm going to publish a list of 48 constellations all at once. They're going to take up more or less equal parts of the sky, which are useful for like navigation, or you could say like timekeeping. And I'm going to use names which are familiar to people so that they're memorable. And those names are likely to evoke images which can be easily matched by people with these constellations, so people can use them quite conveniently for timekeeping and or navigation. And I'm going to put my name on this book with the list of constellations. And then I'll also say that the shapes that I'm likely to see in these groups of stars are defined by the myths that I've been enculturated with. And those myths are going to be a reflection of the cultures that I live in and the way I see, say, like men and women and princesses and kings and queens and monsters. And this is all going to like come to bear upon the name I give to this constellation. And, you know, maybe when it comes to naming the galaxy Andromeda, because it's in the same part of the sky as this constellation, and I can't think of anything, like I'm in a rush, or I want to make it easy for people to figure out what to call this thing, I'm just going to give it the same name as the constellation, which is in the same part of the sky. But yeah, I would say that like there are many reasons, which I would say are again informed by karma, why somebody might not meditate on a celestial body and then try to come up with an articulation or a name for that celestial body which feels true to the experience. Because I would say that many of these experiences feel kind of like wordless. I would say, like, for many people who experience divine directly, giving any name to them at all, which is recognized by other people, can be reductive of the experience. Like, it can, you know, there is a sense often when I have direct experience of the divine that if I name them, then people are going to interpret what I'm saying incorrectly. and then their projections, which are inaccurate according to my understanding or my metaphysical projection of a direct experience. I would say like the inaccurate metaphysical projections of other people based on what I tell them are going to accumulate upon that experience or attach to that experience and distort that experience. And that would feel profane, right? So I think like we're basically talking about many reasons why people might end up misapprehending the consciousness of celestial bodies. But again, like going back to what I was saying about my apprehension of the galaxy, which I call my art, I would say like came from material circumstances and I would say immaterial circumstances, aka like interactions with other people and their projections, which would, I would say, planned for me to experience so that I could dissolve karma, which would make it more difficult for me to apprehend these, I'll say, like beings clearly. And then I'll say that the reason I apprehend this galaxy as my art is because I feel it corresponds, I would say, like the beingness of this being corresponds to my art, which recently I've been describing somewhat reluctantly as, quote, fairness, unquote, which I would say is like more or less aligned with the label of, quote, divine justice, unquote, which I would say, again, is like a translation into English of the energy of my art as it appears in the mythology of, I'll say, like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which I would say is itself a myth which comes from the lineage of the Walkers of Blue Stone. And I feel like most people who are listening will be most familiar with my art as, I'd say, like, people talk about the scales of my art, which are used to determine whether a soul is ready to pass on to the next life. So basically, in the myth, which again, similar to like, I would say, like the karmic stream of myth making that I've been describing so far when it comes to the naming of stars, like the myth is constructed in a way that allows people to communicate direct experiences to other people using mostly symbols and concepts and forms which have, I'd say, common apprehension. So I don't believe that when people are articulating the myth or like the death ritual, which relates to my art, I don't think that they were talking about literal scales being used to weigh a literal heart against a literal feather of my art. In this myth, basically, if the person's heart is heavier than a feather of my art, then that person is not supposed to move on to the afterlife. I don't think that they were talking literally about crossing a river when they talked about like moving on to the afterlife. But again, they were just using symbols and concepts that were familiar to people. And rivers were pretty hard to cross, right? So they were probably trying to illustrate that the process of what I'll call a soul ascending out of our realm of space-time, which most people call Terra or Earth or Pangaea or Tiamat Gaia, outside of the realm of space-time that we call our solar system, which most recently I would say is associated for me with the energy of Isis, outside of the realm of space-time that is our galaxy, which most recently for me I've referred to as the body of Sekhmet or the astral body of Nut, to, I would say, like the conjoined realm or space-time of my art, or quote heaven, unquote. And that's what I would say, that like the symbol of crossing a river is supposed to illustrate within that myth, within the culture that that myth was created for, and in which that myth proliferated before it kind of jumped the boundary of that culture towards like a more popular culture. Um, I would say that the feather is basically meant to illustrate something that's incredibly light, right? Which is meant to illustrate the fact that like the heart has to also be incredibly light in order for that person's soul to make the jump from earth to the conjoined realm of Ma'at, which I'll just call heaven for now. I would say like the heart was employed as a symbol in that myth because, as I've talked about in Why Am I Like This before, I would say that the part of our vessel that connects to or becomes a home for what we call our soul, which connects to the soul complex, which I would say belongs to a celestial body which dwells in the realm or the space-time of heaven or Ma'at, or a realm of fairness and divine justice. I'd say like the heart is like the physical vessel which gives rise to the intelligence which houses the soul. So I feel like from what I'm sharing now, you can see how a death ritual which talks about weighing a heart against the feather of Ma'at in order to determine whether that person's soul gets to like make it to the afterlife could be derived from symbols and concepts and forms which were common to the culture in which that myth was created and proliferated, in order to illustrate the fact that the soul has to be light, as in not heavy, in order for that soul to rejoin the soul complex in, I'll say, the healed space-time of the conjoined galaxy that we call Andromeda and our galaxy. And then I'll say that I think it's like fairly well established at this point that our galaxy is on a path to, I would say, like meet the galaxy that we call Andromeda, and that that meeting could be a collision or it could be a reconciliation. And if it's the latter, then I would say the shared galaxy that arises due to the reconciliation of those two galaxies, and the space and the time which is experienced by the beingness of that galaxy represents Ma'at. And I would say that it's probably not clear via most sense-making vessels or organs or frameworks that it's going to be either a collision or a peaceful reconciliation. But I would say that according to my heart, the reconciliation is on course to be peaceful and generative and not stagnating and not destructive of the intelligence of life. And then I guess I'll offer to set the container so that people can bring their awareness back to what it means for a heart to be, I'll say, shielding, enlightened. And I'll say that probably, and I've talked about this before in the Broom and elsewhere, maybe even in Why Am I Like This, but probably for most people, when they think of the term enlightened, they think about maybe something along the lines of becoming empty so light can shine in. And I would say, like, for most people, that process is often introduced to them by a lineage which is currently known as like Buddhism, right? And in that lineage, in various different sub lineages of that lineage, enlightenment is sort of like a binary process, right? Like you do all this stuff, you like work through your karma, and then somebody transmits enlightenment to you, or you become spontaneously enlightened. And then after that, there is no more enlightening, or, you know, you go from being non enlightened to enlightened from one moment to another. And I would say that, like, it's more likely to have that idea about the process of enlightenment within the framework in which enlightenment means being empty so that light can come in. But I would say that within the myth of the walkers of blue stone, which relates to weighing a heart against a feather, then I feel like what that myth affords is a view of enlightenment which relates not to accepting light from the outside, but to dissolving karma or removing heaviness, which makes the heart heavy. And I feel like this is a much more appropriate frame for spiritual refinement than just sort of willy-nilly opening up to light from the outside. Because I would say that in my experience, when we lighten our hearts by removing burdens, or what IFS calls like parts burdens, or I would call like karmic forms which attach to our trauma, then the space and time of our metaphysical body becomes more integrated. And then I would say that the light that comes from within grows, right? Like every time we snap together moments of space and time which were bound up in karmic forms, like every time we release that karma, so those moments of space and time can, I'll say, like be released into the fabric, back into the fabric of continuous space and time that makes up our body, then there are more, I'll say, like nodes in the network of our space and time. And then I would say, like, the more nodes that are connected within a network, the more bandwidth there is through that network, which is to say that that network can be a more resilient and more stable and higher bandwidth channel for the light of awareness that comes through each of those quanta, or each of those moments of space-time. And that from that perspective, the light could be said to be coming from within the vessel versus coming from without the vessel. And the reason I feel like that frame is important, especially in current time, is because I feel like there are many spiritual practitioners who emphasize taking in light from other bodies. Whereas I feel like in my lineages, I'm counseled to emphasize the importance of discovering and cultivating one's own light, right? Like the awareness of one's own body, respecting the wishes of one's own ancestors, respecting the wishes of every body in our bodies, including the mitochondria in our cells, including the cells themselves, including the organs which comprise the cells, including the systems which comprise the organs, including the physical body which comprises the systems which comprise of organs and cells. And I feel like by extension, you can kind of tune into how I'd say like many spiritual practitioners receive light from other bodies, which causes them to disregard their bodies and to disregard their ancestors. And I'm going to say shielding. One example perhaps is people who consider themselves acolytes of Buddhist lineages who decide to set themselves on fire, right? Like I can see certainly contexts where doing that would be the best thing for their bodies and their ancestors and for all other beings. But I would say that for the most part, it's probably easier to see how it doesn't respect their bodies and it doesn't respect their ancestors. And I would say if you look at the discourse which arises around people who burn themselves, I think it's very difficult to say that it leads to less suffering for all beings, either in the short term or the medium term or the long term. And I guess I'll say I pray that y'all can kind of see how these types of outcomes of spiritual practice, which lead to, like, I'd say self-desecration, can be traced back to models of spiritual refinement which emphasize an emptying of the physical vessel and a disregarding of its needs in order to create space for, I'll say, light or intelligence from other bodies. And I pray that y'all can see how the light that we accept from other bodies may not have our best interests at heart. And if y'all are watching or have read The Three Body Problem, then y'all might be understanding how, I'll say, foreign intelligences may not always care about our intelligence or our lives. And if you haven't seen or read Three Body Problem, then you can probably see how in the history of Earth and the history of, like, civilizations meeting one another in history, how the preferences and the motives of different civilizations can be at odds with one another. And I would say the same applies to receiving the intelligence of foreign bodies without respecting our own life forms. And again, I pray that y'all can trace that back to a model of spiritual progress, which relates to disregarding one's own needs in order to make space for what I'll call the needs of other beings. And then I pray that y'all can see how it's perhaps less likely to self-desecrate if we focus on a model of spiritual progress that emphasizes the unburdening of our souls. And I'm just going to check the chat. Which I haven't been doing very diligently, I'll say that. Oh, this says, to know the flavor of karma we're here to bear is a deeply sacred process to me. And yeah, earlier I did say profane. Sounds like there was a glitch. Lexi says, I feel like I can trace what you were saying to Puritan and condemnation egregores. And what it says, Ashe to unburdening. I guess, like, before I close the container, because I say, like, my transmission feels complete, I just want to hold space to see if any of y'all have anything to say. And of course, like, hopefully this is clear, but, like, if y'all feel called to unmute at any time, cut me off, interrupt, whatever, ask questions while I'm talking. It's always, like, welcome in this container, which I feel like is contained against, like, I'll say, like, disintegrative interjection. Well, it says there are a few glitches, but not enough to distort the recording. Ashe. Let's see what happens when I process it. I'm just gonna, like, tune again into the container of the question to see if there's anything which I didn't gesture towards effectively in my articulation, metaphysically or physically. Obviously, to me, I added on quite a bit about my understanding of the galaxy that we call Andromeda, which I call my art, and the mythology, which I feel is more appropriate for understanding that energy, not in our current time and space, but I would say in the space-time of the timeline where our galaxy and my art rejoin in a generative way. And of course, I also tacked on a little bit about I guess I would say like how I'm counseled to talk about the process of spiritual refinement and how it differs from, I would say, like current time dominant egregores about the process of spiritual refinement. And yeah, I do feel like I I would say exhausted what's available to me in my experience as it relates to Adam's question about how celestial bodies are given names. And I will also say, for full candor, that I understand that my experience has led me to have an opinion about, I would say, like the accuracy of the correlation between how people interpret those names um, to my sense of the actual consciousness of those celestial bodies, which is to say, I don't believe that the names that most celestial bodies have inherited or have been given very accurately describe the consciousness of those bodies. Which is to say that I don't feel that Venus's actual consciousness is very highly correlated with the myth of Venus. And to make that concrete, I'll say that the myth of Venus sort of indicates that the energy of Venus is sort of, I mean, like archetypically feminine, and I'll say like related to like what is often called love, but I would call like romantic attachment, um, or devotion, which I think often also comes from attachment. And I can see that there are modes of devotion which don't. But I would say, like in that example, like Venus historically has also been known in different lineages as a goddess of war, or a goddess who's sometimes a warrior and sometimes an embodiment of peace. So even within different mythologies, there is conjecture about the nature of the celestial body that we call Venus. And then I would say that even though that conjecture doesn't necessarily illustrate that I'm right in my own direct experience of Venus, I feel like it at least opens up more room for people to have their own relationships with Venus, as one example. And I would say that our own relationships with Venus, just like our relationships with one another as human beings, I would say tend to improve in the sense that I am more able to accurately perceive Venus, and Venus is more accurately able to perceive me when our perception of one another is not obstructed by karmic forms which attach to our wounds. And so, as we heal our wounds and we can free our perception from these karmic forms, we can more accurately perceive one another, whether we're talking about other humans or animals or plants or planets or stars or asteroids or galaxies or galaxy superclusters. And then because we can more accurately perceive one another, we can have more, I'll say, mutually beneficial interactions and less interactions which cause either or all of the parties involved in an interaction to disrespect themselves, disrespect their physical bodies, disrespect their ancestors. And with that, I'll close the container and I'll say thank you for listening. If you're still listening, I'll say thank you to Lexi and Hoda for being here live and offering metaphysically and physically to this container. I'll say if you want to support me so that I can continue to do these containers, then you can go to the link should be in the description, but it'll be buymeacoffee.com/Nobu or Jimmy Chan. If you would like to support the pot, which is like the members area of the Broom Radio or the Broom Discord, where these containers are held, And if you would like to support the people who garden and tend in the broom to make these containers possible, then you can also check out a link, but that will say buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio. If you would like to join the Discord, you should also be able to find a link, which I can't read out because it's quite random. And if you would like to join these containers, then you'll have to join the Broom Discord for now. And I would love to have you here, not only for Why Am I Like This, but for any of the live containers that we hold in the Broom, because I feel like if you make it into the Broom, then it would be beneficial not only for yourself, but all of the other cells in the Broom. I would say to collaboratively refine with you. Thank you again for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Peace.